Okay, hi, good afternoon everyone, and thanks for joining us for the first episode of The Blue Thread, which will be a monthly discussion really to explore all things water with different people joining me for each episode. So the idea really is to have it quite relaxed and in different formats at different times. Today we've got 3 speakers and they've got some slides as well to try and sort of develop the topic. But in other situations we'll just do some interviews, or we may even do some podcasts as well. So the aim really of the series is not to be replicating anything that's happening, but it's to take time out really of our busy schedule, because we're all very busy, I think, and try to think about different aspects. And really the theme, I guess, is about our relationship and society's relationship with water in all its different aspects. I think we hope to offer new insights and to stimulate some discussion as well. And I guess, while we don't want to court controversy, we won't shy away from it, because water is so very important to everybody's lives. And at the moment, it's so very political as well. So I think there are some controversial topics, not just in the UK, but worldwide as well. And when we were thinking about devising the concept of the Blue Thread, we thought, really, what better way could there be to start the series than a deep dive into how we as a global society are actually working with water. So how, as a global society, can we still have people who don't have access to clean drinking water? How is it acceptable for people not to have access to clean sanitation, or not to have hand washing facilities in their own houses? And that is the situation it is. So that's really what the theme of today is about. And during the webinar, some housekeeping first, I guess I should say. So during the webinar, your microphones are automatically muted, but that's not because we don't want to hear from you. We do want you to get involved, so please post questions on the chat, and we will have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So I think it's please get involved and let's do that. Also, we are on all the social media platforms which you'd expect. Hashtag the Blue Thread. Please use it and spread the word. Okay, so I think just in terms of, well, first of all, I suppose I should introduce myself. I'm Mark Smith. I'm the Water Sector Director for RSK, and I've been a water professional for over 30 years. So I started first in the UK in 1989, actually, so it's 34 years. And I've done a lot of work in the UK, all around the world, and I still, today, you sort of think after all those years, I remain very curious and worried about where we're going, where the world's relationship with water is, how important it is. But I am optimistic about the ability we have to solve the problems. And one of the things we'll find today through exploring the topic we've chosen is actually, it's not really a technological issue. It's more about how we as a society prioritize our spend, and how we as a society look after the people that need us. So what is our changing relationship with water? Now, as you can see on the screen, the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, also known as the Global Goals, were adopted by the United Nations in 2015. And that really was a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that by 2030, which by the way is only 7 years away, all people enjoy peace and prosperity. Now, of course, by definition, that is aspirational, obviously. And I think when people signed onto that, when all the countries signed up to it, countries have committed to prioritize progress for those that are furthest behind. So those of us who live in the Western world and are fortunate enough to have our infrastructure, the onus is on us, the rich countries, to help the poorer countries get to the position where they actually do have all these aspirations that the rest of us perhaps take for granted. Now, as you probably know, if you're on this call, if you're on this webinar, there are 17 goals in total, and they're all interdependent. And of course, being sustainable development goals, that means obviously being able to sustain, they recognize that development must balance social, economic, and environmental sustainability. So all 3 are really equally important. And today we will dig into what I think is the one that's really the most important, which is SDG 6. And we're going to talk about the decade of change for clean water and sanitation with 3 really interesting guests who are going to develop the themes for us. First, however, I'd like to provide some context, and I think that context is actually on the slide in front of you. But if you think of it, the aim of Sustainability Development Goal 6 is to, and just quote here, ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. And I think it is really the key goal, it's the key SDG. Maybe I'm biased there, but I think that it must be in place before real progress on the other goals can be made. So without access to clean water, for instance, and sanitation, it is not really possible to imagine eliminating poverty and hunger, or providing education or energy. And without water, we will not be able to tackle inequalities, such as gender inequalities. And I think we will not be able to provide work for all. So really, if you think of it, water is life. And as we found out many, many times over the years, and perhaps it's been really emphasized in some recent events, you know, where there is no water, life cannot be sustained. Without it, we cannot exist, really. So all talk about development or growth, it doesn't wash if there is no water. Now, in 2015, when the SDGs were conceived, 70% of people had access to safely managed drinking water, and 47% had access to safely managed sanitation. There has been some improvement, there has been some progress, but if you look at these numbers here in front of you, you know, 70 in 2022, and this is from a recent UN update, halfway point. This is half time, I guess. We've gone from 70% to 73%, and that doesn't sound a lot, but there is a lot more data coming in as well. So I think the data is more accurate. But we still have got, I think, to our shame, really, 2.2 billion people have lacked safely managed drinking water, and 3.5 billion lack safe access to safely managed sanitation. And I think all the other sort of things in there show that there are a lot of really challenging problems. And I think at the current rate, we will still have 1.6 billion people without water and 2.8 billion people without sewerage sanitation services in 2030. So we will really have failed, and we will have failed, you know, 2.8 billion people. That's still 25% of the people in this world. So to me, that there's real emphasis, I think, on why this happens. Why are we in this situation? Because I don't think in my career I've ever come across a technical or technological water problem that we haven't been able to solve. So we can't, it's not like carbon sequestration where technology doesn't yet exist to extract carbon from the atmosphere. It's more, we have the technologies, we have the technical expertise, and why isn't it being deployed? And I think that's a real interesting sort of comment. So I think something to think about as we listen to the next three speakers. So today, as I said, we have three fantastic guests who've really pleased that they've joined us, and they each have a slightly different approach, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from them. So first up is Kit Elms. Kit at the moment is Director of ESG at the Water Research Centre, my old alma mater, and she focuses on ESG in the water sector, currently supporting regulators, water utilities and private industry to enhance sustainability. So for those of you that don't know, ESG stands for environmental, social and governance, and Kit has previously worked in this area across small innovative startups all the way up to large NGOs such as the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent societies. So she has experience in the UK, obviously, and also in the Middle East. And she'll talk to us a little bit about something that I think is really important following the introduction just gave, which is about how the UN Water SDG 6 acceleration framework, which we have seen, is really badly needed. So over to you, Kit.
Thanks for that introduction, Mark, and really glad to be with you all today to go through SDG 6 and what it means now that we are halfway through our decade of action. I'm going to focus on a couple of areas today that are particularly meaningful for me and how I kind of work at the moment with various people within the water sector and broader than that. Starting off really with a bit of an outline of the SDG 6 acceleration framework, which I think will provide some decent context for the rest of this webinar as well. So as mentioned, halfway through the decade of action, we had a really exciting Water Week earlier this year, where we looked at the progress that had been made and where we need to accelerate in order to meet the goals set out within SDG 6, and how we might finance that, how we might govern that. What I've got on the screen for you here is some of the key things really that came out of those discussions, and there, I guess, the sort of, I mean, you could apply these things that we've got on the slide here in front of us to many different areas. So what we've tried to do here underneath this layer is look at how on earth we're going to achieve things like greater data and information integrity, financing, better governance, innovation, and capacity development. You're going to hear from a couple of people today about some of these other areas as well. So I think by the end of today's session, hopefully you'll have a good idea as to how on earth we achieve the wide array of things that come under each of these areas. So the framework also uses 3 action pillars. We've got them listed here in front of you: engage, align, and accelerate. The one thing that really stood out during the talks during Water Week for me were actually the emphasis on communication. Communication was highly spoken about by Antonio Guterres during his speech in the UN talks on this matter. And actually for me, in the work that I do, engagement and communications comes up time and time again as to something that we need to work on. And as a result of that, I'd like to focus on that through kind of looking at 2 key areas where I think we could do better for those of us working in this sector. For me, I think at the moment, the way in which we view water is still kind of a little narrow. For example, if you were to flick back through the World Economic Forum's annual risk reports for the last decade, you'll see water crisis up there as a really important issue among other kind of global threats. But it's always described as a social risk. And actually, I think it's much wider than that. I think it's really heavily an economic risk as well, which means that we need to pay attention, and we need to pay attention now, because without a sustainable global economy, things are going to be very different in not very much time. So the first area then, on that basis, that I would like to focus on is engagement with the finance sector. So as those of you who may understand a bit about ESG, one of the things that comes up a lot is risk, and that's the same for traditional finance. When you're looking at whether or not you might want to invest in something, or whether or not you might want to back away from something, all of that time you're considering the risk and opportunity that you have in front of you. Now, for me, I feel that we're not actually very good at making risk clear in the water sector. I think that we need to do better at facilitating conversations with people like finance professionals, because I don't think that there is enough clarity and we've built enough bridges with those who are in financial decision-making positions to be able to make it clear actually why they might want to invest in a certain area, where it is they could prioritise their funding, both for their own economic gain, but also for society's gain as a whole. And that is increasingly important to people within financial institutions. So a little example of this then, for the first time this year, the CDP was tasked with looking for disclosure on water-related risks from financial institutions. The CDP, for those who are not familiar, they kind of run lots of different disclosure projects for many people involved in topics like water reporting and carbon reporting. This year, we've included financial institutions, which is great. It highlighted the fact that water-related risk is massively under-prioritised, and actually out of the 275 respondents from financial institutions, it was identified that around $203 billion worth of potential value could be accessed through better addressing water risk. And that's not a small number. That's something which, for those of us who are sat in the sector, might be kind of subconsciously mindful of on a day-to-day basis when we're looking at things through our siloed lens. But actually, it's not currently clear to the finance sector how on earth we access that and how on earth we turn it into something positive for society. For me, I feel that for those of us in the water sector, we can often find comfort in complexity, and we, in many ways, gain a lot of comfort from the discussions that we have within our own sector, tackling really complicated problems. And actually, sometimes that can create a barrier for conversations with those outside of the sector who could actually contribute so much in so many different ways. My second point then is on engagement with other sectors, kind of primarily private sector industry. And the reason why I wanted to discuss engagement there is partly on the innovation basis, which is an area where, as you saw from the first slide that I showed today on kind of how we're going to achieve the acceleration framework, is something that is essential. We need to figure out how we can improve water efficiency, how we can find ways of treating water more effectively, recycling that water. And there is so much innovation in the private sector that we could lean on there. So I've got a couple of examples of companies on this slide here who have started to innovate and make waves in the sector. We've got Fujifilm listed up there, who have been looking at some brilliant membrane technology to increase the amount of treated water that they can create. We've got L'Oreal here, who has a whole strategy called the Water-Led strategy, which focuses on reducing water consumption throughout their whole supply chain. And we've got Levi's, who have been working to try and reduce the amount of water used in jean production, which is huge currently. So any gains that they can make in that area is brilliant. Now, the three companies I've mentioned there are, I think, quite aware of their own water use, but I don't think it's necessarily so obvious to other companies. For me, I feel like water is a hidden risk for a lot of companies, and I think, perhaps to put that in the most simplest way, if you were to imagine a kind of apple pie making company and their efforts to try and actually figure out what's going to be important for them to protect in their business. If there was an apple shortage, it would be really obvious to them that they'd need to take action to ensure that either they had their own apple trees to rely on, or they were maybe investing in different types of pie making to protect their supply chain and their kind of outputs in the future. But if you were to try and consider the water use within the apple maker's operations, it wouldn't necessarily be as obvious to say that, suddenly if there was a water shortage, operations couldn't work either. This kind of can be applied all across different private industry. If we were to go for something like data servers, all the way through to something quite as simple as apple pie making, the risk is there. And the way in which we talk about risk is through something called kind of either probability and impact, or likelihood and severity. And actually the severity of water scarcity and water shortage issues is huge, because it will just stop production. Those apple pie makers won't have been able to clean their equipment, they won't have been able to provide water to their workers, and that would have stopped production. But they might not necessarily be preparing for that at the moment. So I do really feel that actually it is through engagement with private sector companies, private industry, where it will be utilising their skills and their knowledge of their sectors to figure out ways to reduce water use. And I put the Science-Based Targets Initiative on this slide as well, to just highlight that there are movements now, there are ways of private sector industry getting involved with water and understanding how they can do their bit. That's all for me. I think I've come to my limit for today. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be here for a couple of questions at the end, I believe.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Kate. I mean, there's lots of questions, lots of thinking. I mean, I like the emphasis on communication. I think that is really, really important. The whole idea of, and something that Sabrina will be developing in a minute when she talks to us. But it's interesting how everybody is so terribly aware of carbon, and yet very few people are aware of risk of water. And you mentioned the CDP Carbon Disclosure Programme. I was just wondering, you had some data there around how many people return and what have you, but what is your perception generally about, do people see a risk in water, or is it just water is one of those ubiquitous things like oxygen we all sort of assume will be there until suddenly it's not there? And how is that being factored in? I think then link that perhaps into the conversation, the link between finance and water. So maybe could you develop those themes a little bit before we move on to the next, before we move on to Sabrina, please?
Yes, of course. So specifically in the finance world, we are becoming more and more aware of water risk. There have been methodologies and indexes created now to start analysing water risk at corporate level and at country level. So there is significant efforts being made to do that. I think we're not quite there yet with the public. I think there's still a way to go. And I think when I say public there, I don't know if it would be appropriate to include kind of small organisations in that as well, but I think both of those entities have a role to play, and it is frankly our duty as members of the water sector to support them in understanding the importance of this.
All right, Kit, there's lots more. I'm sure we'll come back to you at the end for the Q&A, but what I'd like to do now is to introduce our second guest, who is Sabrina Sahor. And hi, Sabrina. Sabrina's with us today all the way from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. So delighted that you can join us, Sabrina. So Sabrina is a marketing and communications executive working for RSK Global. And she's a strategic media professional and particularly focused on influencing the public, private and development sectors on their relationship in water. Something that really interests me about what Kate said, and then I know Sabrina's going to develop this, is communication. And she's going to talk a little bit about how she's using storytelling to convey the challenges and opportunities in development, I think, to various audiences. Not just because I think sometimes, I think Kate mentioned as well, sometimes we get a bit obsessed with numbers. We can overcomplicate stuff. How do we use storytelling to engage with those people that we really do need to engage and raise awareness, not just of the problems, but also funding and collaboration? I'm also interested, Sabrina, and you know this, and I was going to ask you this, is about your personal relationship with water in Tanzania and of your friendship groups and of your family, because you know we sit here in England and we complain that we haven't got enough water, but actually quite often we have plenty of water, we're just not very good at managing it. So maybe if you could develop those two themes for us, Sabrina, but welcome anyway. I really look forward to what you have to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. I just want to say that the conversation around water in Africa and the urgent need for action has always been there since I was a young child. I feel as though this is an ongoing conversation that just needs perhaps different solutions, or we need to discuss the topic differently. I've had the pleasure of living in around 4 countries in Africa, but also living in the UK and seeing how different the relationships we have are with water and how water is communicated. I think it's not news or, and it's not any, just a sec. It's not news, and it really isn't something new to discuss about the dire need for water or the importance of water in Africa or how the SDGs apply in Africa. 1 in 3 Africans are affected by water scarcity. Africa is expected to grow to almost 1 billion people in, I think, in the next 5 years, or I could be wrong. That needs to be fact checked. But the fact is, the demand for safe, secure water the supply can't match that. And it's something that requires us to start looking for solutions in how we talk about water, conversation around water, and how water is communicated. Of course, we can attribute most of it to climate change in how it affects water scarcity in urban and rural areas. These are two different types of lifestyle in Africa, and how the journey for water is affected and how the relationship with water is molded almost. So the fact is, in Africa and everywhere else, water is an essential resource, and we all know that. It's a repetitive story, but it has a direct impact on so many other aspects of life. And that makes the weight and importance of water so heavy to discuss and very, very difficult to capture in just, the SDG infographics that we see, or in the numbers and data that were presented, because of how water affects life and how water molds different relationships in Africa, whether you are in the urban or rural, or whether you are a high income earner, or whether you are part of the working class, or even where you're located, if you're in the Horn of Africa or in South Africa. And although there's been a lot of effort in the last 10 years, for example, the African Development Bank has invested heavily in finding water solutions, and also solutions which cut across many sectors that are affected by water, I still feel we're quite far behind. And the fact that we're still having water conversations in Africa in 2023, it sort of makes you wonder, what could we do differently? And how do we bring innovation and change to cut across multiple development sectors on the continent? So the question is, how are we communicating our relationship with water on the continent? As corporations, as government, in the public or private sector. And it's really hard to decide how we want to represent water. So water, what does water mean to you? Is water a luxury? And this is as simple as, I have a tap in my house, I can open it and I can access water. Very different to someone who has to walk long distances to fetch water. Luxury in the fact that water is clean, it has been distilled, or are you storing water in buckets? So this is the differences in our relationships with water from household to household, based on income, based on location. Water as labor, and at what age young children cleaning or fetching water long distances. So a liter of water doesn't translate to the metric unit alone as 1 liter. Instead, it translates as 5 kilometers, or 5 hours before work, or 2 hours before going to school. That's the measurement of water for them. So the metrics are different. Water is time as well. I was telling someone a story about the different seasons we have in Tanzania. When it's drought season, how we're heavily affected in electricity as well. And so we start storing water in buckets in our homes. So the luxury of using a tap, or the luxury of having water at our beck and go, goes out the window, because we're in drought and income season, so water is then rationed, and then it becomes an issue as well. If you can afford to buy clean water from private entities, then at least you might be able to maintain some luxury in that season. But if you can't, then you then adjust your entire lifestyle, and the access that you have to not just water, but to power, to electricity, to leisure, is all affected by this limitation in a season where we're in drought, or the rainfall isn't matching what we need. Again, demand and supply not meeting. And one thing, especially in the Horn of Africa, and with recent research that we're looking at, is water as home. Historically, people have built houses and settlements around secure bodies of water and where water is accessible. But we're seeing migration patterns and displacement because of water challenges in the Horn of Africa. I mean, we saw Ethiopia and the famine many years ago because of water issues as well, that affect food security, that affect safety, and then that also affect the way in which we can move from place to place. So water being home as well is something that, if you imagine what your home is to you, it's everything, it's your safe place. And then for that to be affected with water, us to represent then water as just this number or this figure doesn't really represent the magnitude of what water represents to different people and what it actually is. And this narrative of water is life, we hear it all the time, but what's the weight in that? What's the weight in always saying water is life, water is important? The SDGs are a target that we have to meet, it's urgent. But the communication of the SDGs and saying that water is life is almost taken for granted because it's so repeated and the narrative is the same. So there's opportunities when using communications in development, but also with the private sector, to try and tell different stories with our relationship with water on the continent, just so that what water is fairly represented and how this water challenges for SDG 6 to be achieved can be achieved. So when we talk about delivering the message in communications, and I had a long think about what needs to be changed in how we talk about water from the continent. I think the first thing that we have to acknowledge is the issue of water in Africa and everywhere else. It's a global issue that impacts and affects everyone. If you start looking at the trail in which the water affects different people, you start to see that the issues in Tanzania don't just affect Tanzania. The issues in Uganda don't just affect Uganda. It is a global issue, and we all have a role to play, whether we are in the developing or the developed world, whether we're in the private or the public sector. And the way digitalization and avenues and public places like social media have really represented an opportunity to tell stories beyond our borders and beyond the continent is an opportunity that we can all use to deliver the message of what water is and how our relationship with water needs to either change or be communicated. Another thing that's important, I think, in any aspect of development is looking at local solutions and mobilizing local content in telling the African stories. So this could also be sharing innovative solutions that have happened on the ground. I think what Mark talked about when we were talking about technology, some of these things don't even need to be recreated. It may just need to travel. They just need to be communicated. They might need to be shared so that they can be improved or they can be adapted. And how are these local solutions getting there, appearing on different platforms across the continent in aspects and platforms that are widely used? So Facebook, which is still king in Africa, radio, which is king in Africa. How are these platforms being used to talk and share these local solutions? Implementation, how things can be done, how things can be changed. And you do this by educating your neighbors and the greater continent of all the solutions that are being done elsewhere. So many companies, especially working in development, will use things like case studies or storytelling, which I've always found to be a very powerful tool, especially when the storytelling is coming from the impacted people. So we cannot be the ones to tell the story for others, but when the stories come from Africans in a village in Shinyanga, or they're coming from someone in Cape Town who's telling you how their lives have changed because of water crisis, then we start creating believable stories. Then we start engaging. Then we start to trigger ideas for innovation. And with these stories, we are looking beyond the data. Data is incredibly important. I'm not downplaying it at all. But when you look at a number like 779 million Africans lack access to basic sanitation services and clean water, then you're not actually seeing what the impacts are. Just that number doesn't tell you how many people are not getting healthcare, how many people are therefore dropping out of school because they have to walk too far, how many people are losing their lifelines in terms of agriculture and whatnot. So when we start to tell stories beyond the data, we start to show the multiple effects of water. And something that I think we need to do is keep instilling hope in the way we communicate. When communications in development, and particularly for Africa, they can be very dark somehow because we tend to look at things with a poverty lens. So it's important for us to also communicate some hope in that there are some solutions. And to just wrap up, the SDG 6 can either fail or be really successful in Africa, depending on how we do it.
Thanks so much, Sabrina. I think it's really, really interesting. I could listen to you for hours and hours about it, because I think even though it is water in Africa and the same here, you know, your personal relationship with water is completely different to mine and to everybody I know. I remember I was chatting to you about this a while ago. I'm like, as a young urban professional, really, you know, you're not the typical sort of, you know, unfortunately, you're not the typical African that we see sometimes on the screens. And yet your relationship with water, and I know in the droughts and stuff like that, you've had to organise your day around access to water, haven't you?
Yeah.
So it's not just the poor people we see on the news. It's everybody. Yeah.
It cuts across all class levels. It cuts across all incomes and locations. But it's just the difference in those types of relationships. So a child might be in the village going long distances to fetch water, and then for me, I face it in a season where I have to plan my day around the rations and the water cuts that the government have announced, so that I can be home to fill buckets and have enough water storage for the next few days. So it affects everybody.
So I think actually, to be honest, just to hear that, I think I'm a lot older than you, but I don't think I've ever made one decision based around the lack of water while I was in the UK. I've always assumed it's there. So I think it's a lesson for every one of us. Anyway, thank you so much, Sabrina, and plenty to think about, and I'm sure there'll be plenty to talk about later. So can I move on now to introduce the next guest? This is a lot of you will know Paul Horton. He's the Chief Exec of Future Water Association, and he's an old friend of mine in the sector. So Paul and I have been kicking around the sector for the last couple of decades. He has over 30 years experience in influencing policy, working with NGOs, not-for-profits, charities, and various trade organisations across the whole water and environment sectors. I think, knowing Paul, I don't think he'd mind me saying he can be quite critical of our sector at times, but I also think he is passionate about how innovation can transform our relationship with water. So what I'm hoping, and I think it's something that we probably both hope for, Paul, is we'll be able to talk a little bit about some research, and I know you've done some through the Future Water Association, into where innovation in our sector is happening. You know, where is it actually, and what subjects are attracting funding, and are those subjects then directly applicable to the SDG 6 challenge, or are they more sort of to improve things in the developed world? And also, I guess, ultimately, how we can deploy these innovations in the pursuit of SDG 6. So Kit mentioned as well the importance of innovation, and I think it'd be really good to sort of try and develop some of those themes. So Paul, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mark. And yes, I've been I picked up on innovation in Kit's presentation, and also just echoing what Sabrina's just said. It's not just about access to water, but if you think of countries that rely on hydropower, it's also access to that power where there's water shortage, and we mustn't forget that. Excuse me. So, as Mark has said, you know, where does innovation sit in this space, and how can we utilize innovation and make it work so that navigating SDG 6, and we actually head to a point of delivering. So I think that's the critical thing. There can't be another SDG process that struggles to deliver. So we all know the background. I probably don't need to repeat this. This is just to highlight the challenges. The Antarctic sea ice has reached its lowest ever maximum volume in 2023, and it's dropped by a big percentage. Surprised a lot of the scientists. We hit the highest global sea temperatures, and Sabrina referred to what that can mean in terms of rainfall patterns, drought patterns, etc. And I think it's a huge challenge, therefore. So, and also just to reflect, when we talk about SDG 6, we think of certain countries around the world, but let's not forget when the UN did its assessment earlier this year, 3 out of 4 people live across the world in what's classed as water insecure countries. I think it's worth having that statistic in the back of the mind, because is that a driver for innovation and change? In my view, it absolutely should be. And even in European Union countries where abstraction is being reduced by 15% or more, I think it's closer to 20% over the last 20 years, 30% of countries across Europe are struggling. They're classed as water scarcity according to the Water Exploitation Index. So, is innovation really moving things along? Well, over the past decade, which is obviously links into the decade of change for the UN, but going back to 2012 in this case, the innovations in water and sanitation systems have increased. It's somewhere between 17 and 20% per annum. Obviously, there's ups and downs, some years less, some more. But I think that's a striking figure, and that change is happening. Maybe not as much as in other sectors, but change is happening. So innovation is therefore available to be taken to other countries, to be transferred. Yeah, right. So where has this happened? Treatment systems, distribution, we're getting cleverer. So, and that's based on monitoring. I'll come on to monitoring in a short period of time in terms of data. There is growth in clever sanitation solutions. We don't necessarily need huge networks. We just need to get smarter in the way we manage them. I don't just mean eco-friendly toilets. I mean lots of other ways of dealing with sanitation. Monitoring, I think monitoring is a big area that really needs to change, and it's core to SDG 6. Behaviour, things are increasing all the time in the way we understand behaviour, what it means, how it's integrated across different communities. Kit mentioned financing, so I won't dwell too much on that, but again, we're getting smarter. And this is all within the need to be more climate resilient. So looking at things from a systems viewpoint is critical. And what is the one thing that can really change? I'm not going to talk to everything on this slide. For me, it's innovation in data, and it's what innovation in data means. So availability, how much data is out there? Do we have enough? Is it scarce? Is it outdated? What's the quality of that data? Can we trust it? Does it make sense? Is it verified? Is it audited? How are we looking at infrastructure? I think that's very critical when we start to get into countries in what we still call the developing world, and the asset health underpinning that. What's our chance and availability to get real-time data and water quality? Well, there's already lots of innovation happening, not just around battery life, but around solar panel life, etc. So not having reliable electricity systems should not be a barrier. In fact, it should drive innovation in a different way. And water resources, we do struggle across the world. This is not unique to any one region, about information in terms of aquifer levels, groundwater in particular. That is a significant challenge that we're all facing. And do we understand what that means if we start looking at different populations? And by that, I mean different groups of populations that are in different parts of a country, maybe not in a city, in a rural environment, maybe those that are more marginalised. I would argue that when we're not there yet, and that's a big part of where we can go in terms of innovation. Obviously, behaviour and cultural data, I think that's a big challenge, difficult to collect, but really important in what we then understand by what people are doing. We haven't got that right anyway in the world yet, so that I think is a big challenge. But in terms of SDG 6, it's really important to understand what that means. And Sabrina alluded to, the big challenge where it's very different in countries that she understands versus countries that myself, Mark, and Kit probably understand in terms of our behaviour, our attitude to water, for want of a better phrase. Pollution and contaminations, there's no reason now not to have what I might call more sophisticated systems to measure what's happening. They don't need big laboratories. They don't need lots of funding going into laboratories. There's some excellent mobile systems emerging that that can point to what's happening in the local environment, maybe whether that's chemical, whether that's pathogen, etc. And the one that's really sat in my mind for quite a while is there's a lot of countries with transboundary challenges. You don't have to just think of the Nile or the Zambezi or the Okavango River Delta in Africa. The US and Mexico is another great example. The Danube. And data collection is very different depending which side of the water that you sit on in those countries. And where it's therefore very different, you get levels of inconsistency. So you need to gather information within a set framework. And obviously, in terms of water stress and climate change, the importance and value of information and data is huge. And it needs to be as close to real time as possible because of the way everything changes. I mentioned just at the start, the way patterns are changing in terms of temperatures and Antarctic ice melt. It all impacts back into the environment, back into weather systems. We've got El Nino at the current time as well, having impacts on weather patterns across the world. So this is where, if we are going to move forward with innovation, this is where I feel we need to go. And if I can just jump back a couple of slides, because I think I jumped on, then it's not moving again. Yeah, no, I'm struggling on this one. So, okay, the slides for some reason are not. Oh, there we go. One of the things we can do is build up what I call a thematic view. Where are the clusters of innovations taking place, and in what space, and how is that important? So remote water monitoring, we can do a lot through remote systems where we don't need to be in the exact position on the ground. There's a lot of innovations around things like water supply and what we might call control systems, or you can call them data hubs. And that is very important because you then build up what is called a convergence map. So where is innovation happening? And you don't need it to be happening directly in water. There could be some brilliant innovations emerging from home appliances, from the fire services, from agriculture, the world of robotics, and what's happening within buildings. And that's information and innovation that can be transferred directly into the water sector, and it can be directly transferred into the challenges we're facing with SDG6. And I'll just finish with one example here that I remember many years ago going into Ghana, and the landline network didn't work. It kept breaking down. So Ghana was already moving towards mobile phone systems back then. It was already ahead of the game when I was there in terms of emails. So you can see what happens with innovation. And I know countries like Kenya were ahead of Europe in terms of using phones to pay for services, again for more obvious reasons. So there are innovations happening already in countries that are under stress, and innovations happening in Europe, US, etc., China, which can be transferred over to the environment that exists in places like Africa. Thank you, Mark. Sorry that jumped around a little bit with the slide issue.
No, that's fine, Paul. Thank you very much. I mean, it's really interesting. First of all, I thought it was quite interesting how we think of water in terms of sanitation, drinking water, and you immediately put the link into hydropower as well, of course. So, if we're affecting the whole ecosystem, we can actually end up with no energy as well as lack of water. And I think that's really interesting. I think from my point of view, the real question is, how can innovation best be transferred to support achieving the SDG 6? Do you have some thoughts around that? Because there's lots of innovation, but some of it's incremental. And what you're talking about in respect to, say, the landlines and the skip about the landlines and just go straight to mobile phones, that's step change, isn't it? So how do you think innovation best be transferred to support achieving SDG 6?
I think, Mark, there's probably two areas. There's existing infrastructure. So what is it that's happening in terms of innovation? where systems are being developed that are different to the standard ones, where it's reliant on pipe networks and other things, and there's a lot of that development work is happening all over the world. So the one part of that is visibility. How do you get the visibility of what's happening globally? And this is where I think a focus on innovation, be it patents, be it through magazines, journals, etc., is really critical. The second thing is the transfer structure. And what do I mean by that? Well, I've worked with, very briefly, an organisation called Desalytics, and they're an organisation that's brought together sort of 9 different communities across 9 different countries in Africa. They've looked at it for how easy it is to take innovations into those communities. They've used it to see how those communities can be developed in terms of their own business in this space. And also they've used it to empower women. And going back to what Sabrina said, often the disempowered are the ones that have to walk hours and hours to get something. So this is already an existing community that's starting to bring together ideas, then develop their own based on innovations that have been taken into the space which they operate, and they've been supported to develop their own business.
And do you think there's anything, perhaps Kit and Sabrina could join us now as well, actually, but do you think, Paul, that there's anything in the innovation space that could easily be transferred to other countries almost immediately? Something that's there that we could do something, to try and drive some of those changes?
Yeah, the work that's being done in data, Mark, the systems that are being developed now, and the sensors, the price is dropping really rapidly, and there's some basic stuff that can be done around that. So you're then collecting the data that helps underpin the decisions that you make, and that approach is lesson learned from everywhere, and it's easy to do that now, to move those data collection systems over. Obviously, along with how does this work in the communities where you take those systems, because the last thing
it's very valuable data, and it's infrastructure light, isn't it? Because you can do it through wireless. So I can see that. I think actually, just putting some of the questions off that are coming through. I've been asked, are these commitments legally binding, and what happens if they're not met? The answer is they're not legally binding. And what happens if they're not met is, I think, severe international embarrassment, I think, is probably the best. Now, at times, of course, the international world is distracted, like it is at the moment, I think, with other events. But ultimately, I think we are getting towards a point of, this just must happen for the world to start to get into the next stage of development. There's no point saying, oh, let's give ourselves another 10, 15, 20 years. I think somebody said there is no planet B. And we haven't even touched. It's been a great session, and nobody's mentioned the dreaded word climate change. So but another question that's come through, and perhaps one for you, Kit, maybe, is the difference between the financial demands for return in building new infrastructure and actually being able to fix existing infrastructure, which won't give the same demands. And the example that's come through is on non-revenue water. So you get, it's quite easy to sort of get a big capital program and build a new network, whereas actually it's a lot cheaper to do to fix the leaks, but also a lot less satisfying and probably more difficult to sort of track financial return. How is that? I guess that's where ESG comes in quite well, isn't it? To look at it through 3 different lenses rather than just a financial one.
Yeah, exactly that, Mark, and non-revenue water is a great example of an area where we're aware of the benefits of fixing leaks, for example, but we're also aware of the efforts where people are actually, in a situation where they can better demonstrate to their shareholders, for example, creating a new system, creating a different system, sometimes creating a better system, but ultimately leaving all of that embedded carbon and water risk still in the ground. And that's where, for me, creating better clarity around these ESG trade-offs is so essential. And actually, we need to be able to speak the language of the finance community in order to be able to make it obvious to them what decision is worth making.
So it comes back again. It's interesting. It comes back again to communications, isn't it? So being able to communicate with people on the ground and being able to communicate with finance services. Another form of communication actually that struck me, Paul, while you were speaking is, I know a lot of the current research is being done in China, and a lot of the patents are being filed in Chinese. What can we do to make sure that that knowledge isn't just lost because a lot of people don't have access to the Chinese language or what have you, or are we ultimately waiting for the Chinese, the people who are fluent in Chinese to be able to come and help us do it?
Well, as part of the reason they do that is their huge water scarcity challenge, especially in the north of the country. But one of the things that's emerging in the more recent work that we've done is that you look at how strong patents are. So not just filed for the sake of it, but the value, the quality, etc., and where they're being filed. And China's increasingly filing in different parts of the world. And so the visibility of what they're doing, the visibility of what's coming out in their journals, which are becoming available in English as well, is increasing quite rapidly. I think the crux for me with this, Kit hinted at it just there, is that you've got an opportunity cost of not doing something, which needs to be measured in terms of the financing and the structure and what happens, and then you've got the cost of actually delivering something, bringing information together. And both the opportunity cost of not doing anything, I don't think is looked at properly. The being able to do things is the cost of doing things is rapidly dropping, and local communities are driving change now and not accepting the reality. And interestingly, they're looking more innovation and not waiting for someone to come and knock on the door with a great idea.
I mean, sorry for cutting across you there. I think that's really interesting, actually. And I think it refers back to what Sabrina was talking about, is people aren't waiting for somebody to help them. It's about empowering people to actually go out there and help them. I was at World Water Week recently, and they were saying, we should be absolutely ashamed that people have to walk 2 hours with a container on the head to get some water in the morning. And really, if we miss SDG 6, that's who we're failing. They're the people we're failing. And all the social problems through exhaustion and children not being able to stay awake at school and all the rest of it, Sabrina can talk about a lot more than I can. But I think, it's been a fascinating conversation, but I'd like to finish up really, Sabrina, with yourself. And how do you think, I think 2 questions, maybe just a couple of minutes, just a minute or so each. How can the private sector be part of the solution alongside development initiatives? And I guess that comes to the sort of not looking at it through the poverty lens. And then lastly, maybe finish it up with, give us, is there hope for Africa, really? Give us, where are we there? I think so. So just a minute or so.
I think the private sector should definitely look to, as Kit mentioned, you need to align, you need to engage, and you need to accelerate the efforts from the governments and other development bodies in how they are trying to achieve SDG 6. And to do this, it also means using avenues in your budget, in your planning, in your daily structure with things like CSR to engage with water initiatives and innovation on the ground. It also means that you need to take accountability for how you use water and how you have an obligation to give back to communities that are affected by high use or whatnot. And it's also just using collective integrated communications with social media, with radio and local platforms to educate and also to work with local communities. These solutions need to be local, and education needs to be shared. Just like Paul said, if it's written in a Chinese handbook, it's a global issue. We need those ideas and we need those technologies here. I always have hope for Africa, just to wrap up. I will never lose hope for Africa, just because in times of challenges and in times of struggle, Africans have shown to be innovative and create solutions. Paul just mentioned M-Pesa, which is bridge the gap with financial inclusion, and that was an idea that triggered out of university students in Kenya. You have, during COVID times when there was issues with sanitation and access to water, local people started using tools that they use to make bicycles and whatnot to avoid sharing, water taps. So challenge is also, they say pressure makes diamonds, but the only way to do that is to share it and to empower it. And also, Africa is growing, our population is growing. the amount of educated and innovative Africans are increasing by the number year by year, and we love our continent. So I always have hope for the continent.
And what a
Always.
fantastic way to finish it. I think it's been absolutely terrific. I think really interesting conversation, lots of different angles, lots of different ways. So really, thanks very much to Kit and to Sabrina and Paul for joining us. And just to say that the next one is going to be an equally interesting topic, which is we're going to talk about taking a deep dive into biodiversity in the water sector, something that has been ignored for a long time. And if you're interested in that, it's it'll be out over social media, but it's on the 15th of November. So anyway, just that, I just want to thank everybody and thank you for your time. I know it's an hour, it's a precious hour of everyone's life, but I really do appreciate it. And thank you. See you again next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.